The world as we know it has changed. This week at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit in Tianjin, China, the leaders of Russia, China and India stood together in a show of solidarity along with 20 other national leaders. So where is the old world order? Well, it's nowhere to be found. There is now a new world order. But how strong, how solid is this new world order? And to discuss all this on Face to Face tonight, we have Mr. Kusum Wijetilleke, who is, of course, a noted foreign policy analyst. Good evening, Kusum.
Thank you very much, Naresh. Thanks for having me.
Right. So, Kusum, did it take you by surprise seeing Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping shaking hands together in such a cordial manner?
Well, Naresh, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a surprise, but I think what has been surprising is the level of seeming coordination, because I think the optics have been manufactured in such a way at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's been built to send a very specific message, right? So when these international meetings occur, you're looking at some real substance that's being discussed, but there's also this optics that's being projected to the rest of the world. Now, this is something that I think, if you recall, when President Putin of Russia met with President Donald Trump a matter of a month ago or so, you'll recall the red carpet rolled out for President Putin. You'll recall the military parade. You'll even recall the B-2 bomber, I think the B-12 stealth bomber was flying overhead just as they took the walk down the red carpet. That's a show of American military might, as well as giving due respect to the Russian leader on American soil. And that was, I think, a very telling moment in geopolitics. Likewise, the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, it shows the other side of the coin. And I think what we have to understand, for example, from President Putin's point of view, having the red carpet rolled out for him in the United States, a country that, has said all sorts of things about the Russian regime, the Kremlin and the invasion, to get that sort of welcome in the United States, probably against the wishes of some people within the EU, a very close US ally. So from that to come towards the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and to have this embrace with President Modi, and this is a rebalancing. And as you said, I don't know if the world has changed, but it's certainly changing. And I think this is a trajectory that we have been, I think, suspecting is coming. But what usually happens is something happens to accelerate the trajectory. And I think President Trump's second administration is accelerating things even faster than many people expected. If you take his first term, I think even then he accelerated many things. Some of them you could argue was in the wrong direction. And now we are sort of reaping the results of that particular administration, and of course the Biden administration thereafter. So I think this is a very important moment in geopolitics, and maybe this is the time, Naresh, when this idea of the global South and about South-South cooperation and the real multipolar world starts coming to the fore. I'm still very skeptical about this. I do think this is more optical than real substance, but let's wait and see, because there are a lot of things that are happening in the world that you probably wouldn't have expected. For example, just very recently, in the last few days, I believe Russia recognized the Taliban, officially, one of the first nations to do so. So that's a big move if you consider the history of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and the Soviet involvement from that period. It's a and you never know which other countries will follow suit and start recognizing the government in Afghanistan. Likewise, we have the Syrian government, which has gained significant recognition from the West. So it's going to be interesting to see how all this plays out and how it impacts Sri Lanka.
Now, you mentioned the optics, and much of the optics, it's stage managed, isn't it? It's not that It's not impromptu. You hardly ever get anything impromptu when world leaders meet. With the possible exception of Donald Trump, you never know what you're going to get. But these are seasoned political leaders. Putin, Xi, Modi. So this is not something which surprised any of them. They clearly, all this had been planned well ahead. So to do such planning, they were clearly thinking on the same page, at least for the moment.
Well, I think this is a case of their interests lining up, right? The United States, as we know, has taken on this form of economic nationalism, right? And this economic nationalism has intertwined itself with their security posture across the region. Another interesting thing that happened during this summit, which I'm not completely sure was planned, was the car ride. Now, there's been mixed reporting. Some suggest that there was a car ride planned, but most of this reporting suggests that the car ride wasn't supposed to last as long as it did. And you'll also know that there were no assistants within the vehicle. So how did they communicate without the translator? So even when they had the huddle between the three of them with Xi, Modi and Putin, they had translators huddled around them as well with an outer circle of translators. That wasn't there in the vehicle. There were other subtle things that happened. There was a post put out by the State Department and also the official social media page of Pete Hegseth, the Director of National Intelligence, that talked about, instead of the Indo-Pacific strategy, they mentioned an Asia-Pacific strategy. Now, this could be just a mix-up of terms or interchangeability of terms, but generally speaking, especially the readout from the State Department containing a very specific term, which is Asia-Pacific instead of the traditional Indo-Pacific, I think that's a very interesting sort of conversation to have if you consider how strained American relationship has become with the Indian government just very recently in the last 1 or 2 months. Remember that India is a major defense partner of the United States. This is a relationship that has been built over decades. But just in the last 3-4 months, we've seen the tariffs that the President Trump and his administration have placed on India, and then very recently they increased the tariffs on account of Indian oil purchases and energy purchases from Russia. Now, I think for our audience, it's important to state that the way we see India, you can only imagine how Indians see themselves. I think any Sri Lankan will understand straight off the bat that Indians take national pride very seriously. So I think even a country as powerful as the United States telling the nation state of India, who you can and cannot trade with, who you can and cannot buy your oil from.
That doesn't work.
Especially with Prime Minister such as Prime Minister Modi, who is someone who's got a pretty wide electoral mandate consecutively, quite a popular politician still, despite, I suppose, the liberal media's coverage of him. He's extremely popular in the global south, extremely popular within India, and together with Foreign Minister Jaishankar, you could never have expected India to take something like that so lightly. And on top of that, Niresh, more recently we've seen, for example, just last month, the air defense, the commander of the Air Force of Pakistan was in Washington, D.C. Quite a deep meeting with members of the security apparatus in the United States. And just to remind your audience that there was an attack by India on Pakistan following a bomb blast in the contested Kashmir region. And
the Pahalgam attack.
That's right, the Pahalgam attack. And the Indian retaliation, took out some very high capacity weaponry of the Pakistani military. It took out some very important radars, I think at least 2 high capacity radars. So I think there is going to be some reckoning by the Pakistani military, and there is some understanding that maybe this visit to Washington was based on that. So you can see how Indian and American relationships could be becoming strained, and how this is another sort of accelerator for what we're seeing at the SCO. Another thing that happened about a month ago was Prime Minister Modi again on the world stage with Lula da Silva of Brazil, and that was also another. They had an embrace. I think it was a very close sort of. They wanted to project how close India and Brazil were, and again that harks back to the BRICS and the conversation around that trading bloc as an alternative to the United States. So these are very interesting, subplots that are happening, and the United States seems to have played into this. One of the things that occurred, for example, during the first Trump term, when they placed these trade tariffs on China, the first round of trade tariffs on China went into effect in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. This was meant to sort of slow down China's manufacturing and export base. It was meant to sort of paralyze at least some part of their industry. Fast forward 5, 6, 7 years now in 2025, what we see today is that China's industrial capacity is stronger than ever. Their trade surplus is at record levels. Not even Germany nor Japan in the post-war era have had this kind of industrial capacity and dominance of global manufacturing GDP. So it is under this context that the Trump administration is trying to maneuver itself on the world stage. But I think the results so far have been quite mixed.
Now, one point that you mentioned about the car ride and the fact that there were no translators. Now, one of the things I can tell you as a journalist, we do pick up a few things when we watch people in action. Both Putin and Modi completely understand English. That's very clear from their facial expressions when somebody is speaking in English. And Z, of course, is more measured. It's difficult to figure out how much he understands. But also, both Putin and Modi have spoken in English in many of their speeches. They don't do it very often. I don't think they like to do it, but they are quite capable of doing that. So they can certainly carry a conversation in English.
Yes.
And I'm pretty sure Z could as well, although there's no overt evidence of that. So they do play a little bit of a game there, where English is concerned.
And to be honest, Nilesh, let's assume that they didn't speak any English, but you can bet that the Western part of the globe is very concerned about that 45-minute car ride, because they just don't know what could have been discussed in there. But even the optics of it, it's enough to make them take a step back and think, right? Because you're not really, because you know that both of these world leaders are extremely cunning operators, and nothing they do is by chance. And even there's very likelihood that they had something pre-planned to discuss in that vehicle. If you just take a look at India, I think there is a Quad meeting due in the next few months, or maybe at the end of the year. India, as I said, is a major defense partner, and they have several key agreements with the United States military. So take one example is the LEMOA, which is the Logistics Exchange Memorandum of Agreement. Then they have something called COMCASA, which is Communications Compatibility and Security Arrangement. They have BECA, which is the Basic Exchange of Cooperation. So, and they have integrated their jet engine co-production with General Electric. They build, Tata, I believe, builds wings for the F-16 fighter jets. But at the same time, India also has deep defense contracts with Russia, and there are Russian tanks that are manufactured in India. So this is a country that I think it's important to emphasize to your audience. India is doing exactly what you would expect. It is an extremely powerful country, one of the largest economies in the world, a very strong nation state, not a loosely connected federation of small states. It's a very strong nation state, and it is now taking its place on the world stage. And it is now put, I think, even with the emergence of Jaishankar, we've seen a very confident India, right? It is no longer willing to accept. Now, for example, India is still not a member of the Security Council, right? Which is quite interesting when you consider how central India is to this Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States, but not having a seat at the main security table, despite being one of the largest economies in the world, a very powerful military, and a country and an economy that's important to stability in the region, it shows that if you were an Indian, you would feel that you're not being taken seriously enough. So this is another moment that India is going to use to sort of flex itself on the world stage and show that, you know, India has options. And I mean, anyone that turns on any Western media, if you just look at the pressure that India has been on since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, you know, in terms of their relationships with Russia, their energy supplies from Russia, the Indian foreign policy apparatus has, you know, battered away every accusation. They've put their best foot forward. They've sent in diplomats who know what they're talking about, who know how to handle the pressure, and they've basically put you know, External Affairs Minister Jaishankar as their main theoretician and propagandist out there, and he's done a fantastic job. Now, this is how in the 21st century, in 2025, diplomacy has to be managed. It has to be a long-term plan. It cannot be at the whims and fancies of one world leader or one foreign minister. It has to be a strategy that, you know, takes in 10, 20, 30 years. And that's something that Sri Lanka has to learn from. In our own region, you know, we see ourselves meandering from one side of the scale to the other. You know, we are non-aligned, but then we have a growing Chinese footprint at one point. We have a contentious relationship with India on one side, but then completely dependent on them when we collapsed as an economy. So it shows that we really have very little strategy. So we are just happy to say we're non-aligned and hope that everybody's happy with us. And I don't think that's really the way to go about it. As you can see, all countries have taken matters into their own hands. They're trying to be more assertive. And I think Sri Lanka has to play its part.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned the non-aligned movement. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was a powerful movement. And if you were one of the leaders of that movement, you were already on the world stage, you know, and so was your country. And Prime Minister Sirima Bandaranaike, for whatever you may think of her administration, she was a well-known figure internationally. She, you know, being the first woman Prime Minister, she was recognized. She was invited to so many countries, and certainly Sri Lanka had a place on the world stage through NAM back then. Because NAM was headed by some very powerful national leaders. You had Tito of Yugoslavia, you had Nasser of Egypt, Castro of Cuba, and of course Mrs. Gandhi, and before that Nehru in India. So NAM was very relevant back then. But over the last 30 or 40 years, NAM has become less relevant. So when Sri Lanka says, oh, we are non-aligned, that's sort of wishy-washy, isn't it? It sort of says, well, we don't really have any proper strategy. That's what you get, because very few other countries actually, you know, hark back and say, okay, we are with the non-aligned movement, because you never hear of NAM anymore, or you rarely do.
I think, Niresh, the problem with Sri Lanka's foreign policy is that it lacks self-confidence, and self-confidence has to be, it's something innate, it has to be internal. So internally in our society, in Sri Lanka, and in our politics, we have so many contradictions, right? And that will show up on the world stage. So just right now, what's happening with the excavation of the mass graves, the foreign minister, Honorable MP Vijitha Herath, you know, responding to a speech by a local politician in India, albeit a very popular and powerful young politician, and, you know, talking about the Kachatevu Island, the president then taking a boat ride to this uninhabited island, and the optics of all these moves. I think it's very clear Sri Lanka suffers, you know, the non-aligned movement is weakened separately, but Sri Lanka's posture internationally has weakened further because we have been unable to resolve ourselves internally. So how can any Sri Lankan diplomat stand up on a world stage and make any statement regarding any other country when we haven't gotten our own house in order, right? Even as we speak, Niresh, we are in a new era in Sri Lanka's politics. We have a government that you would assume doesn't have quite the same baggage as, let's say, a government led by Rajapaksa or Wickremesinghe or even Premadasa for that matter. At least in terms of the national question, they should be able to take matters a little further. But what we see is more vagueness. There is no idea what kind of constitution they might prefer. We don't know where they stand on devolution, real devolution. What is the instrument? What is the unit of devolution? Are you still for this executive presidency? We don't know what they think on the UNHRC. If you look at the last time's submissions to the UNHRC, they were just continuations of previous commitments using roughly the same language. And I think if you keep, I think in another month's time, there's going to be another UNHRC session. In fact, they released the report in August, early August, the UNHRC on Sri Lanka. And I mean, it's the usual thing. There was a wake-up call to end impunity. They call for structural reforms, constitutional changes, their accountability mechanisms. None of these things are finalized. And as long as they keep being brought up in the international media, it impacts Sri Lanka's image. The Chemani mass graves, the mention of extrajudicial killings, this has an impact not just on Sri Lankan society, not just on the armed forces, not just on the structure, on our political structure, but on the national image, right? And these are things that we cannot keep, every year just kicking the can down the road. At some point, you have to confront your past, and you have to answer the questions, no matter how difficult they are, or at least start the process of searching for these answers. Currently speaking, the political establishment in Sri Lanka, we don't understand this intrinsic link between our domestic political scenario and our foreign policy and its posture. We have to get both right. You cannot do one thing internally and present a different side internationally. People will catch on
to that. That's rather schizophrenic, isn't it?
Exactly. And when the international organizations catch on to this, then it looks worse on us. Then we seem exactly to match the caricature that's being painted of us on the international scene. And let's face it, there is a caricature that's being painted of the Sri Lankan society, of the Sri Lankan state. And we know how the war effort is treated by the liberal media. And this record is going to get set in stone unless we set it straight. But we can't set the international record straight until we solve our internal contradictions. And there's just no movement on it. And I think that's a great failure.
Well, I think we need to discuss this matter of Sri Lankan identity much further. But we first need to take a short commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
A trusted place for your fixed deposits. Valuable FD, 10.25% for 15 months, 11% for 24 months. Valuable FD, the symbol of stability.
අපි ඇත්තරම නපුරු පිටසක් වලෙක් මේ ලෝකෙට ගෙන්නමු.
හවස මාමාටම ගෙන්නමුද?
දැන් ඉක්මනටම නපුරු පිටසක්වල ජීවීන්ව හොයන්න ඕනේ.
මේ ඔයා යාට තේරුම් කරන්නකෝ.
හැමදාම හවස පහයිතියට නිකීවේ.
ගන්නවත මට පෙන්නනවා තමුන්ගේ හැඳුනුම්පත.
ඇයි අනේ සෙමි බොයි කිව්වම හැමෝම දන්නේ.
ඔයා හිතන්නේත් මං හිතපු දේවද?
මොනවාද නංගි හිතා ඉන්නේ හැමදාම පහයිතියට සිරස ටීවී බලන්න.
Sammy boy.
සතියේ දිනවල හවස 5:30ට සිරස TV ඔස්සේ.
The wait is over. 8 nations, one dream. The battle begins. Asia's biggest cricket clash returns. Asia Cup 2025. Starts September 9th. Feel the roar. Catch all the action only on TV1.
a trusted place for your fixed deposits. Valuable FD 10.25% for 15 months, 11% for 24 months. Valuable FD, the symbol of stability.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I am with Kusum Wijetilleke and we are discussing the international scene and what has happened over the past few days. But Kusum, now you mentioned the Sri Lankan identity. Well, you spoke a lot about it, and our national identity or the national identity of any nation. There are many aspects which need to come together, and we seem to be still very unsure of many of these aspects. And this all goes back to, I think, divisive politics, because for decades our national leaders were pitting Sri Lankans against Sri Lankans, the different ethnic communities, different religions, and so on, and creating division where there really, in many instances the divisions weren't even there, but they created it and they exacerbated it. So when you do that, your national identity just collapses, doesn't it?
And Niresh, I think you will know this better than most. The fact is that if we do not solidify some form of Sri Lankan national identity, there are people in our country's political system who will do it for you. And you don't want that. You want it to be an organic Sri Lankan identity, not something that's supplanted by elites on Sri Lankan society. And we know that this is something that is being tried. For example, the Chemani mass graves and the issues around it just come to an intersection when the photojournalist Kumanan was recently questioned by the CID over his reporting, and there were no reasons really given for his arrest and his questioning by the CID. And you have to understand this happening in a context of these mass graves and what is coming out about these mass graves. It just shows that we still haven't learned anything. It shows that we are not really caring about this, how this looks to the outside world and the pressure it can bring in the near future. So, and when you talk about Sri Lankan identity, communal politics is part of the brand of Sri Lankan politics now. And hopefully it diminishes as time goes by. But I think the problem we have is that on one side, our economy is stagnant. On the other side, we have sort of a nation state and a national identity that's stillborn because of all these, we had two insurrections, we had terrorism, and we had a separatism prior to that. We've had coups, we have had, extremism from the east, extremism from the north. And this just shows that there are a lot of fissures in our island, right? So just take the Easter attack. Now, it's been 6 years since the Easter attack. We still don't have many answers to some of the main questions. I mean, let's just forget the conspiracies behind it. Do we have a national reckoning with why we allowed such an extreme form of a religion to take hold in an entire part of a province? Has that been looked into? Where did these extremist preachers get their training from? Were there local organizations involved in this kind of extremist preaching? Are there traditional forms of Sri Lankan religions that are being supplanted by foreign imports? These questions have never been asked.
And of course, the extent of government involvement.
The extent of government involvement
is the elephant in the room.
It's now, exactly, it's the elephant in the room. Now everyone talks about it, but there is no official line, even from a government that has no involvement in that. They don't have a dog in that race, right? Previous governments, you could say, okay, one government made the mistake of the intelligence and one government somehow seemed to benefit. Neither of those are in power, but yet we don't have any real answers, and they're kind of sidestepping these issues. So these just show the internal contradictions. So without these internal contradictions, every time we go to the UNHRC, every time we go to these international meetings and we just end up looking like a country that's trying to hide from our past. We're trying to play hide the ball instead of being upfront and reckoning with our own past. So this is something that we have to expect that this president and this government will do, at least get the ball rolling. Because if you don't start, what is the hope of a future government doing that when you are the government that has the most to gain from it?
But Kusum, we are a land of contradiction. We don't know what our constitution should look like. After 70 odd years and umpteen, how many amendments have we had?
Yeah.
And we still don't know what it should look like. And we're going to apparently write it again. And then devolution, we still don't know the unit. I mean, when you look at, let's look at the United States, they know what their devolved units are. You have the 50 states, you have counties within each state, you have cities which have municipalities. So those are the units of devolution. In Sri Lanka, we still don't know because we have provincial councils, provinces, but where are the councils, right?
Now,
we haven't had them for a while.
The councils have been defunct for quite some time.
Exactly.
Now.
So
I assume the country has been running just fine without them. So the question has to logically be asked: do we need the councils?
Yes, but again, if we don't even understand whether we need the councils or not, then this is the contradiction again.
And it creates another contradiction in that this is bridging a certain gap between India and Sri Lanka. India and Sri Lanka, we should be like family. But because there is this issue with the national question, because of commitments that we've made, and because of the harm we've done to our own people and have never had any accountability for it, because of, let's be honest, because of the harm done to us by the Indian nation state and its initial support for the LTTE. This is such a complex thing, but it's holding us back now. We know, for instance, that we talk all the time about trying to connect ourselves to Indian growth. So when you talk about Sri Lanka connecting to Indian growth, we are right next to South India, right? Kerala is one of the fastest growing states. Tamil Nadu is one of the fastest growing states. Are we compromising the opportunities to plug into these economies because of this hang up, because of this hangover from the wartime, because we are unable to look ourselves in the mirror and actually have a reckoning? It's something to think about. I mean, if you just take, for example, the Tamil Nadu industrial sector, it has electronics clusters, it has automotive clusters. I think Foxconn, the iPhone manufacturer, Pegatron, Tata, these are multinational organizations, and global supply chains exist a few hundred kilometers up from Sri Lanka, but absolutely nothing is spilling over into Sri Lanka, and we have to ask why. And
well,
this is
we haven't really plugged into that supply chain, the South Indian supply chain. We have in with other countries, the apparel sector, for example, and our rubber sector. Yes, we are in that global supply chain, but not so much with South India, which is, as you said, the fastest growing region in the world.
And even the Belt and Road Initiative of the CCP and China, Sri Lanka's position in this should be very different. We have got a lot of infrastructure development, infrastructure partnerships, ports, airports, but in terms of technology sharing, in terms of expertise transfer, we haven't done any of that. You don't see our export processing zones having learned anything from the extraordinary export surplus that China has managed to generate. We haven't learned any of the industrial policy from China. So what we've taken from them is essentially superficial, and we've taken a lot of loans as well from them. And if you just take a look at, for example, in the early 2000s, so Niresh, I mean, because we started talking about geopolitics, I'll just bring it back to this point of, since World War II, we've seen this unipolar moment of United States dominance, right? The United States has not only guaranteed parts of the world economy. They've guaranteed the security of entire parts of the world, from Japan to parts of Europe, NATO. Now, this evolution towards a multipolar world is something that's still happening. But in the early 2000s, Henry Kissinger talked about, or we are familiar with the G7. He mentioned something called the G2. I don't think it was his own terminology. There was someone before him, but he's the one who really took the term and said, this is likely the future. So what we saw between the 2010 period till now is sort of a divorce between China and the US, or a separation, because the growth of China, this extraordinary Chinese story of lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, that is a factor of China's plugging into the global economy. That is a factor of American investment, American trade with China, and the normalization of trade relations with China. This is all part of it. I mean, the United States was very open about their hopes that China would someday become a democratic nation. And that's why they felt it was perfectly feasible for the United States to start this trading relationship with China. Now, 20 years later, the United States seems to be wanting to decouple from China. Now, this decoupling may suit the United States government as it stands right now, but there are reverberations to this. And one of the things that happened because of that is the show of hands that we had at the Shanghai Cooperation Summit, because that showed that the other countries are now taking the hint and saying, okay, if you want to be an economic nationalist, then maybe we all should too. And this is where the game is starting to come to a head. So either we, I think, take control of our own destiny, or we're going to be trampled on either side, because as we know, India is already, very much in the American orbit. But even that we see fissures just recently.
Right. So now when you look at the national identity of any nation, and we were talking about Sri Lanka's lack of a national identity, but what we see is several nations which now have very strong national identities. India, they know who they are, and you alluded to this earlier. And then China, they know who they are and where they want to be. The same with Russia. Russia, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia was, pretty much down and out. But now this is a resurgent Russia. So these countries, and then you have Brazil, South Africa, all these countries, they have a certain national identity, and they're very proud of it, and they don't want to be bullied. So at the same time, you have, interestingly, the United States seems to be a lot more like Sri Lanka these days. They don't seem to know what their national identity is under President Trump, and they don't seem to know who their friends are, because you see how they attack Canada. I mean, how President Trump completely attacked Canada. He attacked France.
Niresh, you have to be, for example, if you have to be careful when you ask a question from someone in the foreign policy establishment. If you ask them what is Sri Lanka's national identity, they might say it's non-aligned, because that seems to be the extent of our thinking. Yeah. We don't want to go any further than that. We think that if we give ourselves a national identity, or we might risk our investments from China, we may...
But then non-aligned is just lumping ourselves with a whole bunch of other countries. It's not a national identity.
It is not at all.
We don't say we are Sri Lanka and these are our interests.
What do we stand for?
Yes.
For example, India, part of the brand of India, especially in the West, is that it is a democracy, right? This is one of the main things that the Americans talk about, because they mention that it's the largest democracy in the world. It's the dance of democracy. The idea of so many, hundreds of millions of people voting in such a short space of time. I think Americans are genuinely impressed by Indian democracy, and that plays into their brand. And of course, the size of the country, their cultural, exports to the United States, it all plays a part. Now, take for example South Korea. South Korea also has cultural exports. South Korea also has this national image that they've built, a brand that they've built. And that's happened in the last 20, 30 years. So Sri Lanka can also build this. We have a colonial culture. We have a long history of engagement with the international, as you mentioned, the non-aligned movement. We were front and center at the time, and we have such an interesting political history. And with all this, we are still unable to even develop ourselves and have this national narrative, a story about our people. What is our destiny? Where did we come from? How have we, even the story of our war can be told in a way that people appreciate the complexities of what it was, rather than just painting it as this oppressive, murderous campaign of violence. Explain the intricacies of the post-colonial period, show how it came to be.
Now, Kusum, you raise a very valid point. We don't know, we don't really identify where we came from, what our narrative was. But can I put it to you that we don't seem to know where we're going either. Yes. And I'm not talking about this government. I'm talking about as a nation. Where does Sri Lanka want to be in 10 years, in 20 years? What is it that we want to do? Now, if you ask Indians, they will say they want to be the world's largest economy or the second largest economy, and they've planned it out. They've looked at the numbers, and they are going to be the second largest economy in a few years' time. So they've got those objectives, and they are working towards it. They're not going to allow anything to derail that target, that economic target. But we don't seem to have that kind of target as a nation. I mean, multiple governance. The last 5 governments, if you want to take, did they actually have such a plan? Yeah. I mean, we had President Wickramasinghe, who at one point said we'll be a developed nation in, what was it?
2048.
2048, but he didn't quite tell us
closer.
How we'll get there. So, what do you think of that point?
I think the fact of the matter is that if we can't even make up our minds on simple things like our economic policy, for instance, if you take our current trajectory, it seems to be that a big part of our future economic policy is just to maintain sending Sri Lankans abroad to work in labor and send back remittances. Now, remittances is fast approaching our most crucial foreign currency generator, right? So that just shows, even at a base level, we are not even willing to invest in our own people, keep them in our country, develop the country. We'd rather say, no, we don't want to invest in you. We'd rather you go abroad and send us some foreign currency, which is better. That's the only way to keep our economy going, right? So if you look at the pendulum and how it swung, we were a dominion until 1972. Then we got full republic status. We tried to go the socialist route because there was a bit of a tilt around the world during that time. I think Madam Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, was also trying certain reforms in India at the same time. Then when we saw that India as our closest neighbor, we have a little bit of an issue in terms of if we want to work with them, we may have to play a little ball with them on devolution. Then we invited the Chinese in and we said, be our protector. And China was more than happy to be in Sri Lanka because that's power projection in the Indian Ocean, in the backyard of the United States major defense partner, right? That's the leeway that we gave. Now, 7 years later, the new government signed Defense Cooperation Pact with India once again. So we're just going from one side of the other, one side of the pendulum to the other, and it doesn't seem to be strategically measured in any way. It's reactive. And as long as a country is reactive in terms of its foreign policy, you will get caught in these moments where nobody really knows what's going on.
Yes. Now, we are almost out of time. So one final question. Now you see this resurgence of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and many other countries which have aligned themselves with BRICS, either completely or in some way. Now, when you have that kind of powerful bloc, which seems to be coalescing together. It's still early days, of course. At the same time, you have the United States at the other end of the spectrum, which seems to be is in a trade war with BRICS, especially, and with the rest of the world. Where should we be hedging our bets, or what is our interest? Should we be actually getting closer to those BRICS nations?
What I think, Naresh, is very important to understand is that yes, the BRICS bloc is very important and it's coming forward in the world. But you have to look at each of the economies within the BRICS and the interdependency that you have even between India and China, even between India and the United States, even between China and the United States. This economic interdependency is going to make a contest very difficult. Right now we are seeing this economic context because they are, despite all this interconnectedness, even just think about how many Taiwanese companies operate in mainland China, and then think about the contradiction between China and Taiwan and this one China policy, right? So just within that little block, you can see the contradiction. Then if you take the United States recently sent a senator to discuss security arrangements in Taiwan, right? In the next 3 weeks, there's going to be a major delegation of some of the most powerful industrialists and CEOs and corporate members from the United States going to China, right? Maybe that's what this Asia Pacific conversation was about, because remember that India and China also had some friction. But what we are seeing right now, and the United States has played into this, as I said at the beginning of our show, there's been an acceleration in this moment in the trajectory of the world. And so Sri Lanka's only way out is to have our own ideas and have our own plans. Otherwise, as I said, we'll keep reacting to people. As soon as Donald Trump slapped tariffs, we send Mahinda Samarasinghe and a team there to negotiate lower tariffs. But what is Sri Lanka's interest with tariffs? Not just Sri Lanka's interest with the US. Now, as you mentioned, BRICS. Can Sri Lanka be confident that we can join BRICS? Does that endanger our trading and external relationships with the United States, our largest trading partner, our second largest trading partner?
But have these studies been done?
I mean, there are...
Because, if it boils down to, okay, if we get... we have said that we'd love to join BRICS, but I don't know whether... I don't see any concrete steps towards it. We've just sort of said, well, we'd like that, but not moved in that direction, really. But at the same time, we... as you mentioned, our largest apparel trading partner is the US. So, we need to do some proper studies as to, if we do this, what will happen this way.
And
can't be guesswork.
It's very difficult, Naresh, to do the guesswork, because you can see how quickly things change even within the administration of the Trump team. Things have been changing from week to week almost on yes. in certain months. But then, right?
Kusum, it's a risk analysis, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
You analyze. Well, there is, if we do this, then there is such a risk attached, and is that risk worth it? Worth it for the nation?
Yes. So this is. I'd like to draw an analogy to the banking industry where I'm originally from. So in banking, you say this. There's this thing you say that it's not about not taking a risk. You're just supposed to mitigate the risks. But in terms of Sri Lanka's foreign policy, with this non-aligned culture and posture that we have, it seems like we are more interested in never taking any risks. And thereby we don't need to take any risk analysis because they're not taking any risks.
Has that worked for us?
I will have to ask the audience. I'm afraid from my point of view, we have stayed the same, haven't we, for 30, 40 years?
I would agree with you. Right, I'm afraid we are out of time. My thanks to Kusum Wijetilleke for joining me this evening. Lovely to have you again, Kusum.
Thank you very much, Naresh. Appreciate it.
And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Take care and good night.